It's a great honor and a privilege to have Lou Schoen here in Jerusalem, a dear patient I've known for quite a few years already. Lou, your story, you mentioned that, and we'll go into it, you have a very unique story that you were in Portugal during, with regard to the Shoah, and how your family was saved via Portugal.
Well, you want me to tell the story?
But can we go to the beginning? Can I ask, where were you born and where
I was
does your
born in
family come from?
Coimbra, Portugal, university town which is equidistant between Porto and Lisbon, in 1935.
Wow. And where did your parents come from?
My parents, well, long story, but my parents both come from a little town in central Germany in a state called Thüringen, or Thuringia in English, and they practically lived next door as kids. And my father, oddly enough, for an observant Jewish family, was able to go to high school and on to university when there were very restrictive entrance requirements there was a quota system, and he eventually went on to get his PhD in organic chemistry, which is a difficult field from what I understand. I don't have any talent in that direction. Anyhow, my father got his PhD.
At which university?
Well, in Europe in those days, there was a practice where you went to more than one university. So he went to University of Munich, he went to Frankfurt. Eventually, he ended up at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute after he got his doctorate. And the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute today is the Max Planck Institute for Advanced Science. And it was on the cutting edge of chemistry. Germany led the world in chemistry in those days, big chemical compounds and everything. So my dad worked there, and eventually my mother and he got married in Frankfurt in 1934.
And he was observant?
Yeah, my father was observant.
And when he went to university,
he was observant the whole time. As a matter of fact, they have a thing here in America, American Association of Orthodox Jewish Scientists. That was the forerunner.
Wow.
And when he got to America, he got together with some people, and they carried on at that time. So anyhow, my mother was from a non-observant home, but they were as I said, they lived very close to each other. So my father was in Heidelberg at that time. That's where the institute was, and he reported to a gentleman who eventually won the Nobel Prize for certain types of chemistry. And in 1934. They got married, and they lived in Heidelberg for a little while. Prior to that, this one man who my father reported to, who won the Nobel Prize eventually, came to him and said, he was a Nazi actually, and he said to my father and some other Jewish people who reported to him, he gave them the first opportunity to leave, oddly enough. This was already in 1934. Hitler had come to power in January of 1933. So he called in the people who reported to him. My father was one of them, and he said, I have a job opening from the university in Portugal. Would you go? And my father said, I'll go anyway. My parents had just gotten married, and he went off to Portugal.
Could he see that things were bad in Germany?
He was, yeah. My father, the area my parents came from was particularly anti-Semitic. It was just 25 kilometers from Luther. And so my father was already having trouble walking in the street and everything. Anyhow, thank God they left at the right time, and my father had the offer. Now at that point, Portugal was a very primitive country. It's not like it is today, and there were no other Jews in this town. Coimbra is a well-known university town. It's one of the oldest universities in Europe. And my father and mother went, and I don't know what they ate the first year, but the first few months. But they had everything. My father, well, in the long university break in 1936, my grandmother had gotten to Antwerp, and my father went to Antwerp and got Kabbalah to shech chickens, or poultry. So that's what they had. My father didn't have a minyan for 7 years. We left in 1941, and he did everything himself. He made his own wine, and I remember my father calling my mother, and my grandmother had joined us at that time. To come in while he blew shofar. It was a one-man band.
Were there any other Jews living in the town, or any other
No,
Jews
we were the only Jews. Eventually, a handful of Jews passed through who were fleeing from Western Europe. Anyhow, to make a long story short, Um, we were lucky that we were there because my father's sister, my aunt, and her family were able to pass through Portugal. My mother's brother, and I think there were some other relatives who because we were there, were able to stay. Now, what happened was Hitler moved into the border of Spain and France, or occupied France, and at that point, whoever could leave who was Jewish or was suspect politically left Portugal, because it would have taken Hitler about 24 hours to cross Spain and move into Portugal. Otherwise, we'd still be there. But anyhow, I probably would not. I would never have married a Jewish woman because I'm a Jewish woman there. So even today, there are no Jews in Coimbra, as far as I know. Maybe one. I think our friend Johan said he thinks there's one man there who's.
Did your parents ever go to Porto or to Lisbon?
Well, they went, of course. Well, they went for. I remember going to Porto when they had to apply for exit visa and all the paperwork. But eventually, my father bought tickets to come to America, and he spent all his money for that. And I got very, very ill at that moment. As they were ready to leave, they'd already sold the furniture. We're living in a little attic somewhere.
How old are you at this time?
I was 6, and I had typhus, which today is not very common, but apparently I was at death's door. So he had to cancel his trip, lost the money from the first trip, and then he sold it, whatever he had, a stamp collection, a big stamp collection. He sold that. That was his pride and joy, to pay for the passage. The ship, I've looked it up on the internet, was called the Nyasa, Nyassa.
Nyassa.
Yeah, and
that's a province in Mozambique.
Right, and it was chartered by the I think the Joint Distribution Committee, Jewish charity, and we came on the ship, which I think ostensibly was built to hold 250 passengers, but there was something between 700 and 800 Jews crammed onto the ship. There were only 2 ships crossing the Atlantic at that time from Portugal, because the submarine warfare was already going on.
Luke, can I just ask you, before we continue with this incredible voyage, do you have a lot of recollections of your time as a 6-year-old in Portugal?
Oh yeah, yeah. It was.
Did you go to school? Or
yeah, I went to. I went to school there. My father sent me to a Catholic nuns school, because there are no Jewish schools, and the best school was. So I was. By the time I was 6, I was speaking German, which that was the only language I really knew, because my parents and my grandmother, I only conversed with them in German. So I knew Portuguese, French, and German at the age of 6. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the French and the Portuguese, but I'm still fluent in German.
And did you have a lot of friends?
Yeah, we had friends there, and I have pictures of me in school. And my mother always said she could hear me crying in the morning when we dropped me off at school, because my father got an exemption from the chapel. All the other Glacier kids had to go into the chapel, and I had to stand outside. All my friends were in the chapel, and I was crying on the outside. I don't remember that myself. My mother told me about that. Anyhow, I remember, we lived alone, and it was very primitive. I remember my mother had a wood-burning stove, oven, and electricity was scarce. We very rarely had it, and there was no. So it was.
And there was no anti-Semitism in.
No,
in the
they
time
didn't know what Jews were. I mean, we were the only ones there. So, and my father had rented. We lived in a duplex, nice. Still have pictures of the apartment. Although when I went back about 15 years ago, it was torn down. They were building a condominium where that was. And eventually, we got on the ship going to America in September of 41. We left from Portugal in the ship. I remember vaguely we were stopped at night by a German submarine on the way, who checked the manifest to see if there was any people they wanted to arrest, the Germans.
Do you remember, were there any, I know the Lubavitcher Rebbe also went via Portugal.
My grandmother was on a sister ship. There were 2 ships, as I mentioned. There was the Serpa Pinto and the Nyassa. The 2 of them went back and forth, and at that time they were taking primarily Jews who were able to get away. And my grandmother was on it. She had to get off the ship. She was off the ship, which I'm not sure what, but they stopped and they took many people off and then put them back on again. You can find it on the internet. There's stories about that. Anyhow, we got to New York on Erev Yom Kippur of 1940. And at that time, we moved into two of my aunts had left earlier from Germany. One of them had come through Portugal, and they lived in New Rochelle, New York, and we moved in with them for a short period of time. They weren't as observant, I think, as my father would have liked, so we took a small apartment in Washington Heights. At that time, it was the tail end of the Depression in America, and it was extremely difficult for my father to get a job. He finally got a job with a pharmaceutical company by the name of Endo Labs, which was owned by Jews. And of course, they hired him for a lot less than what his talents were worth, because he needed to get off early on Fridays for Shabbos and the Yom Tovim and everything. But anyhow, he did very well. He wrote a lot of scientific papers, copies of which have. He built the first insulin plant in Portugal. At that time, insulin was invented by two Canadian brothers, sometime 1927 or something. And my father was at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Coimbra, and he built an insulin plant which supplied all of Portugal and the colonies and everything with insulin for diabetics.
That's amazing.
But anyhow, we got to New York, and I was in a shul for the first time, by the way, on a ship, because we were on this ship on Rosh Hashanah, and everybody was there on the ship. And
Do you remember your travels on the ship?
Slightly. What happened was, I was supposed to be with my father. They built this dormitory, 3 stories high, bunk beds. And I was really scared, and my mother was sharing a little tiny cabin with a friend of ours, so I slept on the floor there so I wouldn't have to be in this mass of people in this thing. But anyhow, we got to New York, and it was different. And I went to shul for the first time. I went to a Hebrew school, and then finally I went to yeshiva, a day school.
Which yeshiva did you go to?
Yeshiva of Central Queens. We lived in Queens at the time. And I was in Jewish schools all the way till high school. When I went to high school, I went to a public high school, but we had classes in the afternoon from about 4 till 7 o'clock at night in the shul. And I actually learned more there than I did in yeshiva, I think.
Wow.
So, and then, let me backtrack. Anyhow, I met my wife in 1961, I guess. And we got married in 63. I had to spend some time in the U.S. Army, which was a requirement. And when I got out of the Army, I was working for a large international minerals trading company called Philip Brothers. It was the dream of every young man in New York to be able to work for Philip Brothers. It was closed on Yom Tov, and on Shabbos you could, and a very successful company. And I learned a whole new business. I started in the mailroom. Eventually got into the traffic department, which took care of all these shipments, chartering vessels and things like that. And then one day they asked us to move to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So went to Pittsburgh from New York, stayed there for about 5 years, and we have four sons. One was born in New York, the next 2 were born in Pittsburgh, and then they suggested I move to Australia. In those days, when they make a suggestion like that, if you didn't accept it, that was it. So we went off to Australia, which was a really nice experience. We lived there for 3 years, and then they asked me to move to Los Angeles.
Where in Australia did you go?
Sydney.
To Sydney. In what year?
In what year?
Were you in Australia?
1966 through 69.
And Luke, can I ask, did you have any, after you finished high school, did you go to college, or did you have any...
I went to college at night.
And you got a degree?
I was about 5 credits short because I had moved to Pittsburgh. And when we lived in Pittsburgh, I was traveling all the time. I was constantly on planes, as I was for the rest of my business career. So I'm a few credits short. I went to business school at CCNY City College. Has a very good business school, Baruch School of Business. So I never did finish, but I was about 1 semester away from getting it. But circumstances were to be different. And then we moved to Los Angeles in 1969, and we've been there ever since. And,
did they pick up? I'm sorry to bother. Did they pick up everything?
Yeah, everything.
I don't mean to interrupt you, sorry.
No, I'm just telling you how we got married, how we had the kids. So, and then my mother passed away in 1960. She died in, must have been about 1975 or something like that. and my father remarried, and his second wife had a lot of mishpacha here in Israel. I had no siblings, so all of a sudden I picked up.
You were only
Yeah, I was a singleton, so I picked up this big mishpacha, the bulk of which we here in Israel. We still get together. We're on very good terms. And
You should add one thing,
what?
that they knew each other.
Yeah, my father and his second wife knew each other rather well.
No, the husbands and
Yeah.
wives were friends.
Yeah, her husband died about 2 or 3 years prior to my mother's demise, and we were going to go to Australia, and I had this thing, I was really torn, because I couldn't leave my father by himself, but Baruch Hashem, he was married to his second wife almost as long as he was to mine, and they lived initially in Beit HaKerem when they moved here, and then they moved to Beit Vegan.
But the families knew each other before, so we're
Yeah.
like brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
And you got on well with this?
Yeah, we got along well. We still, some better than others, but we still in very close contact
we
with
knew
them.
them before, they were friends. Yeah.
Okay. So anyhow, we still see them from quite frequently. As a matter of fact, their grandchildren didn't really know their grandfather because he was already passed away before, and they refer to my grandfather as as Opa. So and.
Lou, from your story, I think what's unbelievable is that your father's, the person that he had to report to, who was a Nazi, actually must have. He did your father the greatest favor.
It's interesting because it's not clear whether he was a Nazi or it seems he was, but since they were working for him and developing some of his ideas in the chemical lab, like my dad is one that he won the Nobel Prize for. Carotenoids, whatever that is. You probably know better than I.
Do you recall his name?
Yeah, sure. His name is Richard Kuhn, Kuhn, Professor Richard Kuhn. You can see his biography on the internet.
And what happened to him, just out of interest?
I don't know. He was in Germany and he won the Nobel. Eventually, when Hitler was no longer... Hitler did not want any of his scientists to win the Nobel Prize. I don't know why. It makes no sense. But anyhow, as soon as the war was over in 1950... he was awarded the Nobel Prize that he was first offered in the mid-30s. So,
and he lived in Germany the rest of his life?
I believe so, yeah.
Did your father keep in touch with him?
I don't know. I know that the only thing I know about him really is that when my wife and I went to Germany after the wall came down, my father went with us, and he told me over breakfast one day, how I got to Portugal was this Professor Kuhn is the one who suggested I go there, and he sent the other two others who reported to him. Also, he got jobs. One was I think was South Africa and some other place. But he made sure that the people who reported to him who were Jewish were able to leave well before all the Tzoros started.
So directly, he actually
he
saved
did
your
it.
lives.
Of course, yeah. My parents, yeah. And the family was able to come through Portugal. And we'd still be in Portugal today probably, except I wouldn't have a Jewish wife. There were no Jewish women there. So everything was fortuitous. Anyhow, we have 4 sons. One of them, David, did very well in business with me and retired at the ripe old age of about 50. And he spent a lot of time learning. He started a kollel on his own account in Miami Beach. So he's the head of the kollel there. And
he's a dayan.
Yeah, he's a dayan. Yeah, it's a kollel, Choshen Mishpat kollel. My second son, Danny, graduated math from the University in California, but he handles the properties for my other son, Johnny, in Phoenix. They've done a lot of construction in Phoenix. Danny lives in the Valley in Los Angeles. Johnny lives in Los Angeles. And my youngest son, Joel, is in the travel industry and hospitality. He was born in Australia, and he lives in Silver Spring, Maryland. So the way we work it is, when the kids were younger, they all came on Yom Tov. Now that they're married and they have their own families, one family, 2 families usually come for Pesach, and the other 2 families come for Sukkot and all those other ones.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so we've had this apartment here, wonderful apartment. The location is terrific for about 40 years now. And at first when I was busy in business, we only came intermittently, mainly for Yom Tov, but now we're spending almost half our time here now.
And can I ask, how was it like when you went back to Colombia, when you went back to Portugal? Did you remember the street that you grew up in?
Oh yeah, I remember. As a matter of fact, I thought when I was a young kid, the railroad station in Coimbra, I thought it was like Grand Central Station, a big building. So we went there. It was a little tiny building, a couple of steps to go up, and so that was a surprise. I remember the street that we lived on. I went down there and we found the house, but the house was no longer there. They're building something there. But that I remember. I also couldn't find something. I remember even before we left, there was like a cliff where we lived, and it was an army base, a big army base. The Portuguese army, all on horses, of course. And I was so proud they were going to protect us. But you know, Portugal was neutral during the war. And Salazar he was not against Jews at all.
No, actually, that's very interesting. They actually accepted quite a lot of Jews.
Yeah.
Came through Portugal and they had a safe passage.
I think 40,000 Jews came through Portugal.
Yeah, and they had a safe
I have several
passage.
books here about how they got away. Some who were very wealthy, but it was an interesting time in Portugal. Everything in Europe was blacked out. If you read these stories about Lisbon during the war, there was all the countries in Western Europe, there was no lights on at night, and but Portugal celebrated, I think, 500 years or something or another, and they had this big lights all over. The people who came were amazed at everything. You have to read about it. It's really interesting. And they came.
There are a lot of Jews going to Portugal.
Yeah, they went there, and
No.
a lot of them, you know, lost their money. They gambled. There were casinos there. They lost their money. You have to read about it. And some of them had enough money to get on the Pan Am Clipper. There was a plane. I don't know if you ever heard about it. The back, it's a big plane. It was just there's pictures all over, and they people paid a fortune for it. Of course, it made several stops going across the Atlantic. It stopped in the Azores and in Bermuda and places like that, and it was called the Yankee Clipper. And some Jews could afford it. The rest of them, like us, because my father at that time didn't have any money, we came on this ship that was chartered by the Joint Distribution Committee, and others came on the other ship. I've met people here who the ship stopped in Morocco on the way. There's people we've met here who were on the other ship, the sister ship that my grandmother was on, who also came that way. But approximately 40,000 Jews survived coming through Portugal.
In Portugal. When you were in Colombia growing up, were you aware that there was secret Jews?
No, not
they
at
give
all.
us Maranas like in Belmonte.
No. At that
like
time, nobody really knew about it. It's just in recent years that they've come out of the. Yeah. At that time there was a high-ranking military officer, Bastos, I think was his name.
He actually came out. Yeah.
Right, and he came out and started a shul and started a small yeshiva. But the Vatican, when they heard about it, shut him down, and he was dismissed from the army. So it didn't end well. But the shul is still there. We've passed it from the outside. I've never been there on Shabbat when it's open. We've never been.
That family, remember?
Huh? Yeah, we went to Belmonte, my wife and I. And have you been to Belmonte?
Not yet. But,
interesting, isn't it?
I've met a lot of people. I've actually met people from Belmonte in Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Wow, Lee, this is amazing. It's really.
We met the
I think
family
it's fascinating to think that your father, being in Germany, was actually saved by a German who had Nazi.
Who suggested he leave.
And suggested that he leave.
If you look on the internet under Richard Schoen, it says that he dismissed 3 Jewish students, or not students, but associates. And he didn't dismiss them. Maybe he used that as a cover.
But he saved their lives.
Yeah.
And the lives of their families.
Yeah.
And you're here to tell the story.
Right.
Well, did you tell him about the family that we met?
Well, in Belmont? Well, he's been to Belmont. When we were there.
With that one family.
Yeah, there was they're very poor people. These are mountain people there. You've been there, right?
I haven't
Oh,
yet.
well, you haven't been there. There was a young yeshiva student was sent from Israel, from Brazil. He spoke Portuguese. And he was shechting for them and everything. But today it's with the
They found
East.
out they were Jewish. They didn't know.
Well, they knew it was hidden.
It was hidden.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole culture with the women carrying on.
But we met them, remember? Personally. It was interesting. Wow.
Well, I want to thank you so much. It's
Oh, you're
been
more
really
than welcome,
fascinating, and I really appreciate hearing your
Tell us about your
fascinating
family.
But Lou, thank you very much, and I
You're
really
more than
appreciate
welcome.
it. And you have a really amazing story, and here we see something that
Yeah. And when my son is, with God's help, in the Maccabea playing golf for Portugal, I'll let you know.
it's like a full circle.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So tell us about your family. Okay, I was born in February of 1935. My parents had gotten there a few months prior to that, and we were the only Jews there. So
This is
Here
in Columbia.
in Coimbra, yeah. So my father was on a university salary. In those days, traveling from Lisbon to Coimbra was, it's a long trip. Anyhow, he had to get a moil.
And somebody to do the circumcision.
Right, a moil. So he blew a month's salary to get the moil to come from Lisbon to Coimbra to do circumcision. Okay. Anyhow, 30 days later, I was the firstborn, so he needed a pidyon and ben. He had to import a Kohen with another month's salary to come and do that.
From Lisbon.
From Lisbon, yeah. I don't think there were any Jews in Porto at that time. There's a small community in Lisbon.
Wow. And you've been to Lisbon?
Yeah, I've been to
Yeah,
Lisbon,
we've
sure,
been to
several
Lisbon.
times. And been to Porto a few times.
And do you feel you have, being born in Portugal, do you feel you have an affinity for the
I
country?
certainly do, yeah. I feel very close to the whole thing, and I'm very glad that my son is going to do it. As a matter of fact, when they used to have the parade with the goyim on sukkahs coming
Oh,
up the
yeah.
street, they don't come here anymore, but I have a big Portuguese flag, and I used to wave it, and they'd come over
We
and
used
say
to
hello.
hold it up, and then they'd come over to us.
Yeah,
Remember? The
Yeah.
parade, they'd come over to us.
I still have the flag here if you want to see it.
And if Portugal's playing in football, you'd support them?
I don't pay much attention to soccer, but it's nice to see. The people in Portugal, the goyim, are just very nice people. They're gentle.
It's true. It's actually,
Compared to Spaniards who are hot-blooded, the Portuguese, and we see a lot of them. We usually spend our summers in Switzerland, and in Zermatt, one place we went to, there was more Portuguese there than Swiss. Also in St. Moritz, all the hotels are staffed by Portuguese. They just unbelievable.
One of them
And
we
going
know.
back to Portugal, you've never ever experienced anti-Semitism or
No,
never? No. It's,
Those people
Wow.
are not anti-Semites, no.
I don't think they're anti-Semitic. As a matter of fact, I asked Yochanan, what's with the Muslims? He said the only Muslims we have in Portugal came from India, and they have little shtibelach there. They don't have any mosques or anything like that. There's been no problem with them at all in Portugal either.
What's interesting is that the shul in Lisbon, they were allowed to build it,
Yeah.
and it's not, they were given permission, and Jews have lived a relatively good existence in
Yeah, as a matter of fact,
Portugal.
There was an Egyptian Jew by the name of Amzalak. Have you heard the story? He was best friends with Salazar, and he's the one who got permission to build a shul in Lisbon, and he was on close terms with him.
Yeah.
Amzalek, Amzalek.
Well, Lou, thank you so very much.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for stopping by. We have a
Lou, I want to thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor and a privilege to be with you, and to know you as a patient as well, and to meet you here in Jerusalem. Your story is really fascinating, and I really appreciate the time.
I appreciate your time.
Thank
I have to
you.
go a step further now. Forget